Hello, dear listeners, and thank you for tuning into the European One Sheet podcast. Together, we bring young scholars, professionals, and experts to strengthen dialogue and understanding about the evolving relationship between the European Union and China. To dive deeper into this theme, make sure to catch our new episodes every 2 weeks. I'm your host, Ariel, and I'm honored to be joined by Simon van Oortmerssen and Marc Moquette from the China Knowledge Network. The China Knowledge Network, or CKN, is an organization funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was created to strengthen knowledge around China's evolving policies, international role, and long-term vision. It brings together more than 200 experts across policy, academia, and research with projects like Cosmolab. It is here to support policymakers by disseminating complex challenges shaping the Sino-Dutch relationships, as well as the implications in understanding the shifting international order. In this episode, we focus on the prospects of global de-dollarisation and Beijing's push for internationalization of the RMB amid growing superpower rivalry. First of all, thank you for joining us for the third time. For our listeners, maybe just a quick heads up. This episode builds upon our previous discussion on the domestic implications of internationalization of the RMB, conducted by Shaver. And today we go a step further by focusing on one of the central questions of the international monetary system, namely currency dominance and the evolving nature of the financial panorama. It is important to note that we're not simply trying to explain how the global monetary system is evolving through a power transition theory or a zero-sum game assumption, but what this shift means for economic soft power and international relations. Before we delve into numbers and dynamics of change, it is crucial to clarify the fundamentals of how we assess the role of currency internationally. When we talk about dominance of a currency like the US dollar, what are the key indicators that economists and policymakers look at, and how should we interpret them in practical terms?
Thanks for having us, Ariel. That's really a big question you open the conversation with. Maybe we should chop it into pieces and ask ourselves, before we go into currency and what states and economies use to go by, to orient themselves, we should ask the question, what is money? And because money is many different things to different people on different occasions. And I think it's really fundamental to have a grasp of this core before we enter into the conversation. And I think a first definition we can mention is that it's often used, especially by economists, is that we know money as, a means of payment. If I want to buy a secondhand bicycle from you, I give you the $10 or the $100, and we can transact. And it's very important that those $10 are there, because otherwise, we cannot shape our social relations, you and me. But money is more. It's also a unit of account. We both know that what the value of $10 is. So we can actually transact in whatever shape or form, while relaying this to one simple, easily understandable calculation. So that's a second part of what money is, basically. And you can do this with $10 bills or with seashells. It doesn't matter, as long as you and I trust it. And the third one that's always mentioned in this series is, of course, it's a store of value. If you have the $10, you can actually use it to buy a secondhand bicycle, or you can stack it in a sock under your mattress and it stays $10. So this system is not going to change. You can stock that value and make it a flow later on whenever you are ready for it. So these are three core elements of money in general economic theory, I would say. But there's much more to it. And that what's more to it is often forgotten in policy discussions. I mean, first of all, as I said, money is also a social relationship. It's this trust on which money is based, is also a reflection of the quality of the relation that we have. And money is a part of that. So, I mean, there's a much wider question you can ask. And then maybe more pointedly, lastly, as a first opening of the definition of money, I would really like to ask attention for why actually, as an example, my 11-year-old daughter gets sexual education at her school, but she doesn't get money education in the sense of, where is money made? Who is making money? How do we make money? How do we create it? How do we create credit? This is left out of, of the entirety of Economics 101, because money has a very different function. It's just there to smoothen the relations as seen through economic modeling, and states use that in how they appreciate what currencies do. But money is actually created out of thin air by banks, private banks. If you look at the amount of money that you and I use and that is circulating as currencies in a global monetary system, this is created by banks. To make one example, if you want to buy an apartment, you borrow money. What the bank does is give you the 100,000. This is no longer a $10 thing, but this is a $100,000 thing, and it gives you that money, and it takes the asset of your house as a collateral. So as long as if you buy it, you put it on your name, but the bank really owes it through the contract that you have in borrowing this money. So money is created by banks. This is added to the economy, and if you don't repay the bank, then the bank goes to the central bank, and the central bank repurposes these loans and has an influence to balance this private money creating system. So, I mean, these are three layers of what money is. Within economics, a means of payment, a unit of account, a store of value. In social relationships, something that you and I trust. And when we lose that trust, the first three elements are all gone. And then there is the story about how and who are we creating money. And I think those are three key elements to understand before entering into a discussion on what markets do and states do and how currencies are used and appreciated in geopolitics.
So you would also argue that there's some lack of foundation for financial education, right?
Definitely,
And also,
definitely.
which also may affect the way we see the financial monetary system and how it is deeply embedded with forces that are behind, not only socially but politically, that push for the shifting focus and power within this financial panorama.
Yes, yes,
And I want to quickly define for you what the current hegemon in this financial monetary system is, because I feel like we've mentioned the dollar, but what are the factors that anchor its power within this spectrum?
If I'm not mistaken, this is both a podcast and also it's going to go onto YouTube. So I thought, for the
Yeah,
sake of the argument, right, to prove Marc's point,
yeah,
somehow when I put this random piece of paper in front of me, the three of us in this podcast, all recognize what it is and believe and trust and understand the representation it has, right? And I think
yeah,
that is, and if I give this to you, Ariel, you know what you're getting, right? And
exactly.
that I think that is a very visual underpinning. I showed a 10 euro bill for those who listen of the theoretical framework of money that Marc just alluded to. When you talk about hegemon, it's a bit of a loaded word. I think what I would like to use instead is the most prevalent currency currently circulating. That's a slightly more neutral approach. And I
Yeah,
think
I believe so.
if we look at the three functions that money plays, in all three areas, the US dollar is still the most prevalent currency out there, to answer your question.
yeah.
Okay. And
Maybe
yeah,
to try to link that to the hegemon question without any value judgments, pun intended. There's a good reason why the dollar is so dominant in the monetary system, and as a result of which the one who controls the dollar becomes the hegemon. This is a systemic element in the monetary system, and so the fact that the United States controls the dollar is obvious to anyone, but everybody in the international monetary economy, everybody that transacts and trades and wants the dollar because it's the guarantee for a seamless transaction, a seamless means of payment, a seamless unit of account, a seamless store of value at the global level. And there are historic reasons for it. I mean, we can go into that, but very briefly, we had Bretton Woods. After the Second World War, the Americans had this industrial surplus um, that had to go somewhere. So Bretton Woods was created, and the dollar was the anchor currency of the system. Even though, obviously, at the time the UK wanted something else, but they didn't get it, the Bancor, which would have been a sort of neutral, a sort of Esperanto currency. But the Americans said, no way, we paid for this war, we won, so we're going to have the dollar as the base of the monetary system, and they linked that to gold. So that's Bretton Woods. And so everybody that was trading in dollars could buy this surplus, but they could also trade it in for gold. So there was a global confidence in the strength of the currency. Now, in 1978, with Nixon, we had the Nixon shock. So the Americans took the dollar off the gold peg, and it started floating. And so the Americans looked for another anchor, and they found this in oil. So that created the petrodollar. That was the next anchor for this expansion of monetary trust, and that kept on going the dollar as a reserve currency. And now later on, obviously we had a couple of crises. We will talk about that later, because they are also ingrained in the system. They're built in.
That's right.
But now we are in a situation after the global financial crisis in 2008 and a lot of other events. We're in a situation where this trust is waning in the dollar. And that's linked to elements that are part of the monetary system and part of the definition of who is the hegemon, because money doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is also not limited to what we discussed, what it does in an economy, but it's also backed. It's backed up by military force, which is basically the insurance for the monetary system to stabilize it. And it has links to what you can say, technology, to law, that are all part of this system and that keep it going. And now this system is cracking, basically because there is a reluctance to buy this constantly growing American debt, which is part of the system, which can grow, it can still grow on and on and on. There's no intrinsic reason why it shouldn't be able to grow. But if the trust wanes, this whole thing comes tumbling down. And that is also in part a result of the way we create money, how we use it, because money is created as debt. The moment, you have this mortgage at the bank, there's a double bookkeeping system, there's 100,000 that goes from the bank to you, and the house is placed on the other side of the ledger, and these two are always connected. So by the time you have paid for your 100,000 in the house, this money is disappearing from the system. And internationally, that's the same thing. Now, the whole problem is the hegemon going to repay when I ask my money back? And people have a growing concern that this is going to be the case. And that is why debt is a problem.
Yeah, maybe I totally agree with Marc's statements there just now. I'm just trying to think if I can make it in a very simple. Let's say we're two tribes, right? Let's say somewhere in a desolate island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for the sake of the argument. And there's two tribes, and we've decided that both of us pay with shells that we find on the beach, and the shinier the shell, the more valuable it is, whatever it is. And both tribes use the same shell, so we both have the same trust in the money. But let's say that one tribe decides that I don't know, there's shiny nuts on the island that are also or little pebbles that have a very nice shimmer along it. That's more valuable, right? The soft trust is the soft trust that we used to have, that when I give you shells and you give me shells, we're talking about the same. Now, I might not trust your shiny pebbles anymore, and the other might not trust the shells anymore. That's the soft trust. Then there is the hard trust that says, irrespective of whether you trust my shiny shell or shiny pebble, I now come with my spares and shields, and at spare point will force you to accept my new shiny pebble. Right? So let's call that hard trust. And I think that's a very basic analogy, the dimensions that Marc just sketched on what the most dominant or hegemonic player in this currency domain acts as. I think maybe going back to your original question as well, Ariel, maybe to throw some data in there for those who like it. If we look at 2024, so that's about 1.5 years ago, and that's pre-Iran war and all those horrible things, right? If you look at a number of well-known economic dimensions, you will see that the US dollar is by far still dominant. It holds about 60% of international reserves. It holds about 50% of worldwide international debt, about 50% of worldwide international loans. It constitutes about 50% of the global payment currency. It's about 50% of the currency exchange turnover, followed in all aspects by the euro in the second place. So on the let's say we just discussed the value of money, right, and the three functions it has on all those aspects. In terms of the data where we do the counting, the US dollar is still on top. So that is a straight answer to your question, and it also straight away reinforces the point that Marc makes, in the sense that once you have the prevalence or dominance in any of these areas, it starts to create a network effect, because the trust, either soft or hard, increases. The more people use it, the more people believe it. Again, I'll show the 10 euro piece. If there's no trust in this paper, no one would want to use it anymore, right? So the more people use it, the more it strengthens itself. So that's the network effect that people talk about. And that has been building, as Marc alluded to, since Bretton Woods, to the point where we are now. And that is changing.
So in a way, it could be comparable to, at least for those who study economics, to the economies of scale for businesses, whereby as they grow, they are, in a way, their power is facilitated over the network that you recently just explained. It is important to mention, I found interesting that you mentioned this turning points in a way that have strained a little bit of the soft and the hard power that the dollar has in the international financial system. So would you be able to identify concrete turning points and push and pull factors over the past decades that have accelerated this shift in the international monetary system?
Ooh, that is a very tricky question, Ariel, because it's, as one of our authors wrote, it's slowly at first and then all of a sudden very fast. There is no, there's no single event that you can pinpoint and say, this was it, this is where it all happened, right? You could argue that Bretton Woods was, from the very start, already had inbuilt grievances on the system, right? As Marc alluded to, the UK wanted Bancor, didn't get it. By the way, the UK wasn't alone. Economically, it was a very sensible proposal. It just didn't fly politically. So maybe it was flawed from the very get-go in terms of the... but definitely the Nixon shock and the fact that we decoupled globally, nationally issued a sovereign currency from a hard-backed standard, be it gold, silver, or whatever, and we went to fiat currency, which then by default becomes explicitly trust-based and trust-based only. Right?
Yeah.
There's nothing else behind it anymore. As Marc said, if the central bank says, here is $1 trillion, okay, right? I can't see the equivalent in gold. I'll take your word for it. And because the whole system runs on it, we'll say, yes, it is a massive... Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor is Not Wearing Any Clothes. But as long as nobody says it, we're all assuming the clothes are on, right? So, yeah, that is sort of the fact that we went from at least hard-backed to no backing, fiat only, is also definitely a point in the change journey that contributes. There are further factors where you'd say, okay, you can look at, for example, institutional stability. How tight do you run your ship as an institute, be you the Fed or the ECB or the Bank of Japan or the People's Bank of China or whatever other central bank you have? How much feeling do you give that you're in control? And people believe you because reality plays out accordingly. And especially there on the US, given the, I think, financial crisis in 2008 was definitely a dent in the global credibility of the stability of at least US financial markets. No, I'm not saying central banks, but financial markets. But by implicitly, central banks should be having a role to control the stability of those, right? That's another dent in trust. And I think if you zoom in more recently, you will find that indeed US debt is exploding exponentially, and the refinancing discussions become trickier with the moment. I'm not an economist myself, but the US Treasury 30-year yield curve has been doing things that have not been seen in a while. That does not give trust. You can talk about, well, how stable is it in terms of independency, right? Is the governor of a central bank as independent as the agreements that were made prove to be? In other words, if you look at the US, at least in this case at the moment, right, there's been public discussion on the trust that, or the independence that Jerome Powell has. So these are all at a very large time frame, right? From a Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods financial crisis, most recently, points, and I'm just using US as an example because it is the currency hegemon, right? These are all points that contribute to a slow but certain erosion of trust. And the interesting point is, or the interesting question is, when do you reach the actual tipping point? And that is a very, and I will use this word on purpose, that is a very complex matter, because we're not only talking about the hard financial side and the accounting thereof, we're not only talking about the trust issue in the institutions, but we're talking also about all the other issues that Marc alluded to earlier that are all moving, and the amalgamation thereof is what determines whether you're in a tipping point or not. It's very hard to spot, but what you can see is that the situation as it was is indeed changing.
Yeah, maybe it also brings us to China, this answer, and the question you asked, because I think that's one element that we have to take into the equation here. Obviously, financial markets and the position of the dollar, I mean, they have been very constructive in assisting China in integrating in the global economy through massive investment, and there were private interests involved, and there was good money made. And now the situation has changed. Of course, many people have seen it coming a long time ago, but we were not discussing it. That obviously China now comes at par economically with the US, and financial markets are a bit in a split, because on the one hand they want to make good money out of China, and there are still plenty of possibilities to do it, but they can't follow their own rules anymore, because China has become so powerful in part by pushing back international rules on finance, on trade, on how to integrate in the global economy. And honesty would also force us to admit, those who are skeptical about how China did this, that China has become the success it is for its own population, economically speaking, because it pushed back on those international regulations, because otherwise they would have been simply bought up, like what happened in the Soviet Union after it collapsed. There's a very interesting book by Isabella Weber, and she's a German economist. I think she teaches in Columbia, and she wrote a book titled something like "How China Escaped Shock Therapy," and it's the only book where I think there is a solid account of what happened inside China, on how actually the party socialists and the adapters that after Deng Xiaoping were opening up to, okay, we have to we have to catch mice. It doesn't matter what color the cat is. That's what Deng Xiaoping said in 79, 80. And China has just itself sort of crossed that river in from the socialist system to the capitalist system, touching the stones. And there was a
Yeah.
very elaborate discussion on the inside. And us, from looking from the outside, we're just seeing, well, okay, well, they will come by, they will turn into capitalists like we do, they will turn into Democrats like we are. And this all that
Yeah.
it didn't happen. And now there's a reset, and that reverberates in the monetary system. Because the position of the dollar obviously is not as strong as it was, the reserve position. But then again, it's not necessarily going to end up in a situation where we have to choose between a dollar or a renminbi hegemon, because, in my opinion, the alternative to dollar hegemony is just a division and a fragmentation of that hegemony, and there will be necessarily place for all other currencies to fill up the gap of trust. But that also asks for a different political system and a different political arrangements. So that very much is, now we're getting to the core of what hegemony all is about. And it's not just about the technical part of financial markets, it's very much a political question.
So we can all agree that, of course, the dollar is still deeply embedded in the global financial system, but as you suggest, its dominance, it's in a way evolving in uneven, selective ways, and there's been an addition of events and shifts that have accelerated this transition. So again, as the system is maybe not collapsing, but potentially, let's say, evolving under pressure, this naturally, as you mentioned before, raises the question of alternatives. And the thing that stands out the most to me is the fundamental mismatch between the massive role that China plays in the global trade order and the comparative, let's put it that way, minimal influence it has in the international financial order. I have the chance to delve into your report that describes the RMB internationalization as a long-term project that has so far only seen modest progress despite significant policy efforts. So my question is, how should we understand this apparent gap between China's economic weight and the still relatively limited international role of the renminbi?
If I'm not mistaken, I think we talked about turning points, right, in terms of trust.
That's right.
I think for the Chinese, maybe another interesting turning point to bring to the table and then continue your questions, also to look at what happened with the Russian Federation after the fall or after the end of the Cold War, right? That got imposed our system. And I think you can read the post-mortem, and it didn't work out as we had wanted, right? For the Chinese, seeing also the financial aspects thereof, that was a dire warning. Now, the financial crisis was another one. And given the interlinkage, right, of our monetary systems, if I just only isolate monetary system, right, the ripple that the 2008 crisis caused worldwide was massive. Now, if I'm the head of a country, I would like to minimize my exposure to disturbances to my own domestic peace caused by factors outside of my own country, right? I think that has been sort of the slow starting point of China considering that putting all its eggs in one basket, the US dollar, is maybe not the most stable, or better word, resilient way of running my international side of my monetary policy. So, in that sense, that's been 2009-ish. So we talk about roughly 15 years. That's why it is a slow process, right? And then you can make it even slower if you have to consider that China needed to build up its capacity to get to a point where it could choose an alternative other than follow the dominant system, right? So it's even longer in that sense. And what China has been doing ever since, under that idea of let's minimize the ability to be shocked externally, is to slowly make inroads in internationalizing its renminbi.
I think what is very important to highlight here, and an observation that was made by a colleague of yours, Mr. Bert Hoffman, in a CKN interview, is that of course this financial crisis in a way bring scarcity of liquidity, which in turn pose a great burden on developing countries. And I feel like countries such as China, who have the potential to revert the situation by providing, let's say, an alternative pillar, is indirectly or directly appealing to those countries who don't want to be fully dependent on the dollar, especially regarding political transitions that shift very, let's say, dramatically the hegemony or dominance of the dollar in the current financial international system. So, would you argue that this reflects structural changes and features in the international monetary system in itself as a whole, or does it? I mean, what is China's main objective? Is it to displace the dollar dominance, or is it to establish a different pillar? How exactly is it aiming at achieving this objective? What kind of instruments do they promote to internationalize the renminbi? And how does this fit into China's broader monetary strategy?
I think the core of your question is what does China seek to achieve,
Mm-hmm.
and using monetary policy. Well, first of all, it is of course building out its industrial strength through the
Mm-hmm.
BRI system, and that's also where money is created and credit is created,
Yeah.
and this strengthens China as the pivot of an economic set of relations that
Mm-hmm.
is growing very fast. Um, China uses it. It cannot apply the same strategy that the United States has or that Europe is doing because it's not opening up its currency. That's the reason why the UN is not a reserve currency, and it will never compete with the dollar seriously in terms of a reserve currency. So that, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, a currency that everybody uses, even if you trade between the Netherlands or New Zealand, we can do that in yuan, in renminbi, but nobody's doing it because it's not convertible. So you can't go to China and say, hey, I want to have dollars, and they will not do it very fast. And that's also because they have a fundamentally different view of the function of monetary policy in the international system,
Yeah.
because they have a different standard for the international system than the Americans and the Europeans do. And the standard is, for the Americans and Europeans, having been on top and being the part of the, in the core and not the periphery of the world system, they say, we have wonderful rules. They apply to everybody equally,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a globalized financial system, and that is just bringing prosperity to all. Now, Mark Carney, in his famous Davos speech a couple of months ago,
Mm-hmm.
had ventilated his opinion on that, and he's a central banker, and he said, actually, we all knew that the system was rigged, but we pretended that it was there and open and a level playing field for all. Well, China is acutely aware of the fact that this does not offer a level playing field. It has weaponized its own economy against, being eaten alive
Yeah.
by Western corporates and economic pressures on China, in part because of their vivid memory of a colonial situation that they, their 100 years of humiliation, as they frame it, that we do not consider. We think in the Western world, okay, we're decolonialized and this thing has been fixed in the 60s and we don't talk about it anymore. But of course, there are all manner of structural relations that are also part of the monetary system that are still in place. So China defends itself, and it has worked out a way to grow in spite of the fact that they
Yeah.
don't follow the rules. And it
Mm-hmm.
now has a proper recipe, and it is a parallel, a rivaling system, you can say, with the Western system. But now to your
Mm-hmm.
question about the global South, it's not a parallel system where that is able to take over the Western monetary system. And why not? Because also countries in the global south are acutely aware of the risks. They are aware of the risks, and they live them, of accepting sort of the World Bank IMF type of approach of development that is being criticized a lot in academic quarters and in political quarters. They can also not accept the Chinese system, because as China is eating now Europe in industrial terms, it is also eating, because of its strength, the industrial capacity of middle powers and emerging markets. So these are also acutely aware of I would say, the lack of difference of being eaten by the dog or by the cat. So it's also a threat. It's not an alternative in the sense of this is going to liberate the world system, and we will live happily ever after and in a well-balanced state where we can really grow prosperity for all and divide it on an equal base. So also China is aware of this, and it means we are in a position that we should talk with Chinese counterparts on where the middle ground is, and that is a political question. It's not a technical monetary question.
Yeah.
I think it is, yeah, it's a very important point. But my question would be more revolved around how does such a configuration actually translate into practice, and how would
I can take a step in that area.
the scenarios and implications be if such multi-pillar system were to emerge?
Yeah.
It is true that, of course, it might arise tensions, especially by the hegemon, because, of course, it is feeling threatened by this so-called quiet rise of the RMB. But how does it actually translate into practice? How does it work? Do you think it's compatible, feasible, or rather not?
Marc?
I think it is, basically.
Yeah.
And that's why I would like to refer it as a matter of political choice. But obviously there will be winners and losers in this game. And put very bluntly, I mean, we have a secure and prosperous, let's say 1 billion people that are globally the West, and they have a history that arrived through which we arrived at this point. And there are 7 billion people that also want this prosperity, that in part have it as a result of the Western system. We should not forget there's a middle class in many people, and they have vested interest in joining the system and keeping connected. And and then you get into the politics. China is through the instruments of swap lines with other central banks, through the instrument of an offshore renminbi that is still very tiny. That is absolutely nothing if you compare it with the offshore dollar. I mean, the euro dollar is the other name for the offshore dollar. It doesn't have anything to do with the euro as a currency, but it is the fact that outside of American banking system, dollars are being created globally, and they circulate in an offshore system which is global, which is humongous, and so there are enormous interests here, also related directly to our own prosperity. We should be very careful about that, but that is where you have to seek a sort of balance. And one of the other instruments that is also coming into play is the payment system, where China offers the CIPS, which is a system that is in competition with, I would say, the normal banking system for payments. And why? Because in part there is a history of weaponization and sanctions on against important players in the global system, and they are being ejected from its payment system. So they look for different types of and different possibilities to be able to use their money. As Simon said, they just switch from pebbles to shells, or from shells to pebbles. And one of the examples that's very interesting, and I think it's promising in a way, to try to find the equilibrium between all these interests, is that there is now trade taking place between countries. Around 85 countries are trading outside of the dollar, outside of the euro, in their own currency. And they're settling, as a means of payment, and they pay each other in each other's currencies. So they pay with shells and pebbles, and there is a system that allows for this trade to take place. And I think that's a signal of how the monetary system is adapting to this mounting pressure between, this also a waning dollar that is being defended and a mounting renminbi that will not break through because it's too dangerous for China yet to open up its currency. But there's a lot of friction there, and I think the fact that a growing number of countries is doing its trade settlements in local currencies and is actually having a system where this works I think is a sign of adaptation of the system to its internal pressure.
Yeah. And maybe if I can add a few more examples. So your question was, is China aiming to become the new monetary hegemon, right? I think Xi Jinping himself has said, we want the renminbi to be a strong international currency. And that's it. He didn't say we want to be the new hegemon. So and that's not the only statement. There's no statements that would indicate that there is a desire to be hegemon, but there is a lot of statements that the renminbi wants to play a strong international role. So let me answer the question from that angle in that way first. I think your second question is around, and maybe before I do that, to become a hegemon, right? There must be there's some conditions that go with it. For example, you must have full convertibility of your currency. Well, that's not the case with China, right? As David Lubin has explained perfectly in your previous podcast. But there's also, it must be seen as a safe haven. Is the renminbi seen as a safe haven by other countries worldwide? No, not really, is the opinion, the consensus opinion. Is China going to be a global consumer of last resort, right? Current consensus is no. Does China enjoy global political trust and legitimacy in its currency? Maybe not the same everywhere as well, right? In terms of, does the party represent the state and the people, etc. So when you look at, let's say, the criteria that people usually assess a hegemonic currency by, China simply at this moment is not in a position. That's the consensus among the economists. Nor has Chinese leadership said we want to be. That's the public statements. So that's a very direct answer to your question. Now, in terms of then, how does China want to build the strong international currency? Marc already alluded to a number of things. I think I can add a few more where you could say SIPs, right? We talked about that. The China CBDC, central bank digital currency, is under development. There's been an M-Bridge system. India has started paying in renminbi for Russian oil, right? So there is some of that. China has now enforced the settlement of its trade that it has outside of China for nearly 60%. And that is in part thanks to the infrastructure of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It has special drawing rights at the IMF, if I'm not mistaken, since 2016. There's a few others.
It would like a little better treatment in the IMF, but it's not getting it. So this is
we're seeing dim sum bonds, right? Offshore loans. We see that in September 2025, Russia sold its first RMB denominated bonds, and other countries are planning to follow suit. So there's the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. There's these gold, the offshore renminbi, which is gold backed, with the gold vaults to be planned in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. I think also in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia. So there's a lot of areas where, especially international trade, China is making very strong inroads and is becoming increasingly stronger to have its currency play an international role. So those are, I think, some of the mechanisms that you were asking that underpin that movement, as was stipulated sort of as of 2009, of the role of the international role of the renminbi.
Thank you very much. Adding to that, we can also talk about the swap lines where China facilitates this exchange in currencies with friendly, with friendly currencies with its partners. so that at any point, exchange in between these currencies and Chinese renminbi is always set at the same exchange rate, which also facilitates investment and does not create this, let's say, financial uncertainty that other financial crisis with the dollar might create in this sense.
That's
I
right.
think comparing swap lines from the People's Bank of China and the Fed or the American central bank, they're basically the same thing. So I don't think that there is a swap line arrangement that is less or more risky in the Chinese system than in the American system, for example. If you want to compare them, swap lines exist because if there is a demand for a currency and there is intensive trade, then you don't want, if there's a credit crunch or there are problems, you don't want the trade patterns to get disturbed, and you sort of have a backup system between central banks, and they can, with their local banks, balance the situation. That's what swap lines are for. And so I don't think that there is an inherent advantage. I may be wrong because I'm not a specialist, but I don't think that there is an inherent advantage to Chinese swap lines as different from I would say standard swap lines. There is, however, the situation for the Chinese is also gradually changing. There is an interesting scenario page in the report that you quoted from CKN that was written by Bert Hofman and Johannes Petri, where you see four quadrants, and where set apart because the external environment of China can be adversarial or can be more benevolent.
Yeah.
And the internal policies can be more conservative, fearful, or reformist, with a higher risk appetite. And then you get four quadrants. And China is actually walking through these quadrants. It starts seeing the international and renminbi as a sort of safety net, which is very defensive in its approach, with a limited exposure, no SWIFT, it SIPs, very limited dollar systems integration, and it's especially reinforcing this renminbi payment system internationally. So that's a very basic position. Then it moves. It has already done. It added the BRI. It added regional initiatives.
Yeah.
It added the promotion of renminbi, but without financial liberalization. And so that is called, in these scenarios, it's called a slow ascent. It's getting up. And we have already passed that. We're now in a third phase. So the third scenario applies, which is called rapid rise, where there is a still benevolent, but we don't know how long it will continue, external environment, and where the reformism in China is still there, because it realizes that it's dependent on internationalizing the renminbi. And so then they accelerate this internationalization by opening these financial markets, not to every investor, but gradually. So first you have qualified investors, they're the real biggies. That's also why before you have politicians travel and talk to each other, bankers do.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to see these patterns, and national security agencies do. It's very, these are not, obviously politically, these are fragmented movements. But in the world system, this is an integrated story. And so here, China is opening up. It's making the exchange rate more flexible, not fully, not in one go, but it's seeking to integrate to have maximum advantage. And it's developing the SIPs internationally. And we're now in this rapid rise scenario. Xi Jinping himself has said, that this internationalization of the renminbi is something to channel wisely. And now the interesting question is, what's the next step? Because we're in this third quarter. We came from a safety net to a slow ascent to a rapid rise. And in my humble opinion, I would suggest we can go two ways. Either we go into an adversarial environment, and the Chinese are still ready to adapt and reform because they feel strong enough that with the BRI they can pull it off. You will see a great leap, pun intended, by the authors of the report, a great leap forward in internationalization of the renminbi because they feel secure enough that they can control it in their BRI environment. Or they pull back. They go from the rapid rise into the slow ascent because they have to reorganize themselves like a porcupine strategy because the pressure is too great. Now, of course, this is not just a monetary policy question. This is also a geopolitical question. And here you have to deal, and then the discussion becomes really next level. You have to deal with the military industrial complex, the financial industrial complex, the technology industrial complex, and the legal industrial complex. These are all complexes, and I refer to them as complexes because this is not an analysis that we can enter into simply thinking that it's nation states that are key actors in it. There's a bigger thing going on here, and nation states are part of the story, but they don't necessarily, have the power to influence how this system is being shaped. And then, of course, we are beyond what the nation state can represent, and there we have a problem. By the way, so there's a sort of absolute max. You have to go into these systemic relations where a lot of speculation is inevitably part of what we are going to talk about because the information is there, but it's not ready and open for us to consider, but it's there. And the alternative is, if there's a real, I would say, tension mounting because of this big story, the only thing that people in nation states with the representative governments can do is organize themselves. And then you go to the micro level where money is actually doing exactly the same things, but it's much better. It can be much better controlled. And then I refer to systems like community wealth building. We need more place-based investment because this macro thing between nation states and corporates and banks is going to have its own dynamics. But what can people like you and me who want to trade a bicycle for a $10 bill we can do? Well, we have to take care of a decentralized approach to monetary relations and a community-based and an ecology-based approach to monetary systems. And this is also very much part of our Cosmo Lab, where we discuss the need to really consider much more seriously, bioregional relations, so that we ground the currency not in gold, not in rare earth elements, what the Chinese obviously can and perhaps will do, but we do it in bioregional resources and community relations. And that's a very different type of trust. Sorry to be long-winded about it, but that's the big story, I think.
Maybe referring back to your first point, if I got it correctly, you in a way suggest that anyways China is moving away, transition away maybe gradually from this more regional or network-based internationalization towards more wider spectrum that might put the RMB in a, let's say, more dominant position within the international monetary system. However,
and adversarial at the same time.
Yeah,
it
adversarial.
can't dominate.
So
there will be more adversarial. They will strengthen also the adversarial character. Yeah.
That's right. However, as we've discussed over the whole podcast episode, it is likely to remain somewhat gradual and somewhat uneven. So this also raises broader questions about the role of other major currencies, and in particular, in this case, the euro and its evolving system. So if we turn to Europe, the euro is often described, especially by the European Central Bank, as the world's second most important currency, yet its international role remains relatively limited compared to the dollar. So my question to you, Simon, is how do you assess the euro's current position in the international monetary system, and what explains this gap?
Maybe before we go there, I'll take a detour. I think
No worries.
the creation of the Eurozone is also, of course, if you look at, you just talked about points of increasing hegemony. But let us not forget that up to, I think it was January 1st, 2001 or 2002, that we got the euro in the European Union. We had, of course, different national currencies within the European Union as well. And in that sense, the euro in itself as a creation was probably a very interesting signal in the monetary landscape, and how that positioned itself in the hegemonic situation that was currently happening at that moment. The other thing I want to bring to the table before I try and say a few more things about the euro is that the euro is indeed now a player in the multi-currency landscape. If you look at, for example, the percentage though it takes in terms of payment, it is quite low. And there's absolutely voices that in the current geopolitical climate that would, for example, argue if US companies doing business abroad put invoices in US dollars for US companies, right? That strengthens the position of the US dollar. If Chinese companies, via BRI or not, do trade abroad and invoice Chinese companies to their foreign companies in renminbi, that strengthens the renminbi. How does that situation look like for European companies doing trade abroad, and are they invoicing in euro, yes or no? And the question by and large is most of the times, no, they don't. Right? So that's just one small example of how currently the euro is positioned and what a consideration or a field to tackle might be for, let's say, Brussels, vis-a-vis how it wants to position the euro in this probably emerging multi-currency landscape, and how you want to hedge all the various bets out there. And Marc just alluded to the size of the complexes that are out there. This is a tricky game with a lot of aspects. The interesting thing I want to add on to that is that we just talked about a lot about the US dollar and the renminbi, because that's a very important part. I don't want to leave unmentioned that in terms of payments, especially, there's a whole raft of regional initiatives that have sprung up in the last decennium that maybe not all listeners are familiar with. So, for example, in Latin American, right, you've got the CPCR or LAYA, you've got the SL structure under Mercosur. If you go to Africa, you've got the PEPs, you've got the SADC. There is in Asia, you've got, apart from the renminbi, you've got the ACCDA, you've got Project Nexus, you've got the Chiang Mai Initiative or the Rapid Financing Facility, and in the Middle East, you've got Gulf Payment System, AFAC, BUNA. So, just want to bring this to the table to illustrate the point that we are not only talking about renminbi versus US dollar, and there's also the euro, that we see a global move towards a fragmenting of the payment system. And that will have repercussions, slowly but surely, for all these institutions that Marc also alluded to. Now, in terms of the euro, again, you can argue that for the European Union, for geopolitical consideration, you might want to strengthen the role of the euro abroad, or turn it around, protect the euro internally in the European Union against external shocks, like China is doing. That is a question where, if you entangle that, it's going to be a lot of wisdom, and I certainly don't have a playbook at hand that will give you all the steps to go by, but it certainly is something that should be thought of. If I may take the liberty, right? When we talk about then what do you want to do with the euro, it also begs, if we go back to the very beginning of our talk and the point that Marc just alluded, it begs the question: what is the role that you want money to play? Right? What's in it for the people? It's nice that we have these notes in our wallets or on our bank accounts on our telephones, but given that current global currency systems or monetary systems is inherently extractive value based, right? So with your fishing boat, you go to the sea, you kill that whale, and boom, all of a sudden you extracted the whale from the sea. Now you have value, right? You can sell whale meat, or you can take ores out of the earth and boom, you've got rare earth material or oil, whatever. Right? It's all extractive value based, and that is going to inherently run into a limit, because there's only one planet to extract from. So Not only on a multi-currency perspective, we're being asked some tough questions, given the fact that we're exceeding all the planetary boundaries, etc., etc., etc. We're also being asked questions on the use of currency at large and what it represents, right? So it again, depending on from what level you zoom out to the question, whether it's a very specific, how do you want to do your strategic invoicing of euro versus, okay, where do we want to go? You will find out that there's some good questions to be asked and some options that are still out there. So I like some of the ideas that Marc put on the table, and there is no way with if you're of good faith and you have trust in each other, that these cannot work worldwide. Let's be frank. Yeah. When we traded silk routes, it was not like the people in Xi'an took out a loan against Roman ancestry, right? That was payment, and transactions along the way, all the way between Rome and Xi'an.
Yeah,
it has worked before. Maybe it has some inefficiencies, but to whose advantage is that?
I think that links perfectly to the last two questions that I had planned. The first one is, what factors establish the euro as an appealing alternative in this case? So we've talked about the different ways a currency can be used or can be perceived, and the value that can be added by each of them. So would you, for example, argue that it's because of the derivation of the rules-based order or normative power Europe? And my second question is alluding more to your first point. So to what extent does structural factors such as unique constitutional framework or, let's say, fragmented strategy limit the role of the euro in the financial panorama? Is it more as a result of the market forces or political choices?
Yeah, if I may, on the first one, I think that's really the core question. It's really the essence of our existence in Europe. And I think we have a chance for the euro to offer an alternative, in as much as we do two things at a time that are very difficult to combine, which is managing the market forces that are inherent in the monetary system that we have now on the current horizon, that you can call Horizon 1. And that's one thing, but we will not be an alternative and we will not be successful with the euro if we only do that. You also have to go back to what Simon just says, and if I translate that very briefly, you have to recognize, let's call that Horizon 3, you have to recognize, looking from a planetary systemic perspective, that this system in itself grows exponentially, the money grows exponentially, and puts a pressure on social and ecological relations that is not sustainable. So whoever wins the currency war will be the winner by taking the last 4 bananas out of the supermarket. But whether you do that in renminbi or dollar or euro is just completely not interesting from this vantage point of a planetary systemic perspective. So it has to balance this first horizon with the third horizon. And then, of course, that brings us to this horizon number 2, which is, what do we do now in order to, with others, by collaborating, move from Horizon 1, which is a dead-end street, and we're totally focused on it, to Horizon 3, which is a clear opening to a better monetary system, but only if you do that on a planetary understanding of what money is all about. And then we have a chance, and that means in incremental steps. And in a way, we can learn from the American and the European and the Chinese experience, because the same way China is before a choice now to either take the great leap and accept the adversarial nature of the renminbi in the monetary system, and weaponize its system against the dollar-euro system. And what we are doing against not only the renminbi, but also, players obviously in Russia, we have not been discussing it, and then we can weaponize And that would be for us a step back, in the same way as the Chinese are now before the choice of a rapid rise or a slow ascent, a slow, going back to the safety net where the
Yeah.
Chinese came from. And we are being pushed back into our safety net if we don't deal with it. So I think that's a long-winded reply, but the basic prerequisites for success as an internationalizing euro is to do that on the second horizon and to get other players in the monetary system tag along to diffuse this adversarial double great leap that will end in violence and war, as it has been for many times before.
Maybe if I can add on to that with a bit of a twist. When we talk about China, if we take a really long view, right, it is also interesting to consider that the current capitalist system is as it is and is extractive value based, etc., etc. It's a very European concept. It is maybe also good to realize that I think China under the Qin dynasty first nationalized the monetary system within China, right? So that was some 2,000 years ago. And even before that, and we talk 700 before Christ, I think it's the warring states. There is this. There's a book written. It's called the Guanzi. That is around 680 before Christ. That talks about how it's basically the economic textbook for how to run your economics for your state from China, so 2,500 years ago. And the interesting thing is it has a very strong focus on the real economy. So let's be very clear, no derivatives, the real economy. And for it to serve the people and maintaining stability of the state, because once the state is stable, the people will be more prosperous and everyone will be happy. In a twist, it is maybe interesting for Europe to look back at the philosophical concepts behind that thinking and apply that a little bit to Europe as well. And then you'll find that you'll probably have a lot of common ground, not only with the Chinese, but I think the Americans and the Russians and all the other big currency issuing states in this world would also prefer that the state is stable, the people are happy, and with the extremely diverging wealth globally, right, where we talk about the top 0.001% of the world own more wealth than the bottom 70, right? Maybe that is also a philosophy to kind of curb things a little bit and put the wealth of the people and not the few back to the fore and create some more stability. Anything that is way out of whack it reverts back to the mean. And the question is not whether it will, because it will. The question is how, and how will wise leaders make sure that people are happy and healthy as it happens. That's an example. Of course, I don't have the answer either, but that's maybe an interesting thought in the light of European-China relations to look at this problem and approach it.
I think that is the perfect conclusion to this podcast. I think we have had a very thorough and fascinating discussion on that topic that sits at the intersection, as we have previously mentioned, of economics, geopolitics, and global governance. What emerges quite clearly here is that we're not only witnessing a simple transition from one dominant currency to another, but rather a more complex reconfiguration of the international monetary system, where there is continuity, but at the same time competition and fragmentation, which altogether coexist. We have seen that the dollar remains deeply embedded as the dominant figure in the financial system. The renminbi is expanded in a more gradual and strategic manner, and the euro remains strong but continues to face structural constraints that undermine its potential. Simon, Marc, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. It was a truly pleasure to have you on the podcast once again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the European One Sheet podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow the European One Sheet podcast for more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thanks for having us, Ariel. And that was a wonderful conclusion.